All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for our first 2021 legislative pre-session predictive session with Lester and Steve, who are no strangers to any of us. Lester is our governmental representative and has worked with FRPA for about 12 years now. And Lester, I am going to hand it off to you to get down to business and introduce our guests today.
Great. Well, thank you, Eleanor, and thank you all for attending this afternoon. We're extraordinarily fortunate to have with us Mr. Steve Bousquet, who is a syndicated columnist and editorial board member at the South Florida Sun-Sentinel. Steve, for many years, was the bureau chief, the Capitol bureau chief for the Tampa Bay Times. Steve is a student of Florida history and politics. We often play trivia about the old times in Florida, and usually he wins, but occasionally I can stump him. He wrote a wonderful master's degree thesis. He has a master's degree in history from FSU about the now iconic and famous Walkin' Lawton Childs, his first campaign for the United States Senate. So Steve, again, we really appreciate you taking the time. This is a committee week here in Tallahassee, and Steve told me as we were preparing for this meeting that he's also in his editorial board duties going through a lot of interviews with candidates in South Florida to determine which of those will receive or not receive his newspaper's endorsements. So with that, Steve, I want to back up for a minute as we start and sort of take a look back at the 2020 election cycle. And let me start with a couple of observations, and then I'm sure you'll fill in with what I've missed. I thought it was interesting and a lesson for all of us that the polls were wrong again, especially in South Florida, and more particularly with Hispanic voters in South Florida. And I think the takeaway from that is there probably going to be some new approaches to polling that we're going to see going forward, but they're going to be untried and possibly even more unreliable. Second, and I think this is of great interest to our FRPA members, and this is one of those believe it or not statements, that voters in Manatee, Volusia, and Collier counties voted to raise their taxes, yes, raise their taxes to fund land conservation and parks. Nationwide, 47 of 49 such measures were adopted since 2010, and 16 since 2010 have been adopted here in Florida. Third, we had, as I'm sure many of you are aware, historically high voter turnout in Florida. Almost 80% of voters turned out, 11 million more or less. The important thing to know about that, in my opinion, is that 9 million of those were either early voters or by mail. And I think that's going to dramatically change the way campaign strategy and tactics are carried out. Campaigns are going to start earlier and they're going to cost more money. Republicans have tightened their grip on the legislature. The Republicans flipped what they refer to as flip. That means that these were seats held by Democrats. They flipped 5 seats in the House and now enjoy a 78 to 42 majority. In the Senate, 24 Republicans and 16 Democrats. The reason that's important is because as a result of the 2020 census, Florida will, the legislature will begin the process of reapportionment, and with Republicans strongly in charge, they should be able to tilt the maps to help their incumbents and to build some new safe seats in areas that are growing. As we know, there's some 300,000 people a year coming to Florida now. And finally, maybe Steve, you can add to this, that as a result of the 2020 election, Florida is much less purple. In other words, not so much of a swing state. Democrats and have had virtually no power in state government for a quarter of a century, 25 years. And as someone perceptively pointed out when they were trying to explain what happened in the election in Florida and how well the Republicans did, they said that you have to remember in Florida that north of I-4, Florida is Alabama with more guns. So increasingly conservative. Would you agree with that, Steve?
Yeah, I would for the most part. It was a pretty awful election cycle for Democrats. And it was a lot of the damage the Democrats suffered was self-inflicted. The Democrats don't work hard enough to register voters in between election cycles. The Democrats did not fully appreciate the political potential damage of this whole line of attack about defunding the police. That scares suburban voters. Most people support and want strong law enforcement protection. People don't want police to brutalize anyone, but they want the cops to be there. Defunding the police sends the wrong message to those suburban voters. And then, of course, the greatest single reason why the Republicans did as well as they did was because they got their vote out on election day, and they pounded home that message in Dade County that Democrats are on the side of, quote, socialism, unquote, which is a distortion, a smear, but Democrats didn't answer it. Boy, you know, one of the most basic rules of politics is no charge, however irresponsible, reckless, and untrue, no charge goes unanswered.
Right.
The Democrats violated that rule.
So the typical, without putting too pejorative a point on it, dysfunctional Democrat Party in Florida.
Yes, but it's why I really enjoy this state so much as a place to live and as a place to cover news and political news, is because Florida is such a dynamic place that it's the electorate is different every cycle. It changes so much. So I'm sure I'm jumping ahead, but I'll just whet everyone's appetite, I hope. I mean,
oh, that's great.
The Democrats are already casting about for a candidate who can beat Ron DeSantis.
Right.
And in my opinion, they don't have one yet, but they're looking, and maybe they'll find one, maybe they won't. But for example, former Governor Charlie Crist wants to run. I'd be very interested in hearing what some of the people on this call think about, who may be Democrats, and what they think about the idea of Charlie Crist running for governor again. He, just to refresh people's memory, he was governor from 2006 to 2010. He loses a Senate seat to Marco Rubio. He comes back in 2014 as a Democrat against Rick Scott, almost wins, loses by 1 percentage point in what was the second Barack Obama midterm. And now he's in Congress, and he thinks, I've talked to him at length in the past week, he thinks DeSantis is dreadful as governor. He thinks he's completely botched the whole vaccine response, and is the least transparent governor in Florida history. There's a lot of truth to that. We could talk about it. And Chris may want to run. And so you've got a whole raft of other people out there, from Nikki Fried to Val Demings to Anna Eskamani, also looking at running for governor in 2022. It's going to be a long campaign. The campaign for governor is going to be underway by this summer. And so if you like long campaigns for governor, you're going to get your wish this time.
That's right. Be careful what you wish for, right? Well,
Yeah.
let's just pursue that a little bit because I think people are interested in that. You listed some of the Democrat wannabes, so to speak. Can you tell us a little bit about each one, or do you want me to do that? Or I'd be interested in your perceptions of that. I mean, you and I know who Nikki Fried is. I think a lot of people in the real world, we say these names and they think, well, who is that? Why is she or he, if they even know that she's a woman, why is that a potential to run against DeSantis?
Yeah, well, I'll quickly summarize or give thumbnails of three people who I think are possibilities. They're all women. And it's long past the time when we should have a woman governor in the state. Most states have had a woman governor by now. Some states have had multiple women governors. Anna Eskamani is a very intriguing individual because she has an exceedingly short resume in politics, but she is a social media whirlwind. She's definitely a progressive. She's from the left wing of the Democratic Party. She is highly committed and engaged on things like the broken unemployment website and DeSantis's governing. She's a state house member from Orlando. She's the first Iranian American to be elected to the Florida legislature. She's, I think, 30 or 31 years old.
Right.
People in Tallahassee know that she has, it's interesting, she has an identical twin sister, Ida, who's a lobbyist for social justice causes. And they are truly indistinguishable.
Yeah.
You see them sometimes. And anyway, Anna Eskamani is the future of the Democratic Party in the state. There's no question about it. Gwen Graham might want to run again. Gwen Graham, Bob Graham's daughter, ran last time, has been very active, has kept up a steady, intense critique of DeSantis on Twitter. If you haven't seen a dozen of Gwen Graham's onslaughts against Ron DeSantis, you're not on Twitter enough. She was on CNN 2 hours ago. Then there's another intriguing candidate, and that's Val Demings, Congresswoman from Orlando, African-American, in her 60s, FSU grad, former Orlando police chief. She was one of the impeachment managers in the first Trump impeachment. Right. She managed one, and there's still this perception. I'm not sure I buy it. There's this perception that you're in a much better place if you're from the I-4 corridor. Right. But the record is replete with I-4 candidates who've lost statewide elections. Yeah, I agree with you. That's just a trope in Florida politics. Oh, if you can control the I-4 corridor, you can win. And it doesn't ever seem to happen in terms of the Democrats. Florida is precariously close to becoming a long-term one-party state. The way the state was, frankly, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. This was a one-party state under Democratic control for a long time. It's not good. It's not good whether it's Democrats or Republicans. And so we're definitely looking down the barrel of that at the moment. Like you said, reapportionment is just around the corner. The Republicans control the redistricting process. They're going to make it harder for Democrats to get reelected to Congress. They're going to make it harder for Democrats to win legislative seats. And with the redistricting cycle, you've got the governor and all the statewide cabinet members also on the ballot. Right. Yeah. Well, speaking of statewide cabinet members, can you tell us a little bit about Nikki Fried, who's another woman Democrat, putative governor candidate? Sure. She's the agriculture commissioner. I think we're one of 2 or 3 states in the country that has an elected commissioner of agriculture. She's been very visible in that job. She's been very, very forthright and strong on several issues. Certainly the pandemic and the bumbling response that at times we've had with and the death rate with COVID-19. But she's also been a forceful advocate for Amendment 4, which is the constitutional amendment to restore voting rights to ex-felons. She is from Broward County, Fort Lauderdale, the biggest Democratic county in the state, one of the biggest in the country. She's a media savvy person. Now she won by an incredibly narrow margin as ag commissioner. So, I think she has an uphill battle. I mean, she's the only Democrat elected statewide at the moment, so that definitely counts for something significant. But she also occupies the most obscure statewide office by far.
Yeah.
I mean, if you stood in front of a public shopping center in Polk County and asked 100 people, who's the commissioner of agriculture, you'd have a hard time getting a solid response. So she's got a long, long way to go to build the kind of name ID you need. I get back to Charlie Crist only for the basis of comparison. Charlie Crist probably has 90% name ID in this state. That's something that every other candidate's going to have to raise and spend $10 million to get.
Literally, that's
$10
right.
million is an astronomical amount of money. You have to raise money morning, noon, and night for 6 months.
Yeah.
So Charlie Crist has that going in on day one. Charlie Crist has run statewide. I looked it up the other night. He has run statewide 6 times. That's an astonishing number.
It really is, because he was elected as Attorney General, and then back before the latest round of constitutional revision, he was elected as the state's education commissioner, as I recall.
He was elected as education commissioner, attorney general, and governor.
Right.
So anyway.
That's great. Well, thank you. Let's turn now to the budget. The state has really significant budget challenges in the context of the COVID pandemic and the economic repercussions of that. As our members know, the budget is the only must-pass bill. By consensus estimates, I would say, and Steve, if you disagree, let me know, but they're looking at a shortfall of somewhere around $3 billion. The denominator is, 93 billion last year, and the governor's proposed budget is around 96 billion. So while $2 or $3 billion sounds like a lot of money, in the broader context, it's not an insurmountable obstacle, I don't think. The problem we have in our state is so much of the so-called general revenue dollars, which are largely sales tax related, some 25 to 30% of those dollars are paid by tourists. And we don't need to explain to anybody on this call about what's happened to tourism in light of the pandemic. And then at the same time, because of the economic repercussions of the virus, programs, Steve referred to the unemployment compensation program, the Medicaid program, which provides essentially health coverage for almost 5 million Floridians. It's about a third of the state budget. There's been a projection for a 19% increase in the need for Medicaid program to serve several 100,000 new enrollees, people who have unfortunately met with unemployment and still need health care. So that plays into it. But to start, Steve, I'd be interested in your opinion. There are also options available to raise more money. And we know that new taxes, and I put the word taxes in quote, have been anathema to Republican legislators for this quarter of a century, essentially, that they've been in charge. But there is a possibility, and I'm wondering how realistic you think it is, that Florida would finally implement a full internet sales tax. which the revenue estimates say would generate some $800 million. Florida is one of 9 states that does not fully implement the collection. Texas did it 2 years ago and raised $1.3 billion from that. Is that a realistic possibility, or is that wishful thinking?
I think it's a realistic possibility until it gets to the governor's desk. When he announced his budget a week or 10 days ago, he said, I'm not in the business of raising, he was asked about the internet sales tax, and he said, I'm not in the business of raising taxes. That was his answer. So I don't think it's going to happen. Again, even though it's important to note that this would be requiring, Amazon already does it, but it would require, Amazon does it voluntarily. We're one of the few states that does not require online sellers to collect the sales tax on purchases. And because we're a sales tax driven state, it's a big, big revenue generator for Florida.
Right.
The business community is almost completely united in support of it. Because again, it puts brick and mortar stores at a competitive disadvantage with online sellers. The store on Monroe Street in Tallahassee is required by law to collect the sales tax. The online seller in Wisconsin is not required to collect it. Simple as that. And so, but I still wonder about it. What people should be concerned about is that while this deficit is big, it's not catastrophic by any means, and the economy is going to slowly pick up little by little if it isn't already. And you got to beware of politicians in Tallahassee using the pretense of a budget deficit as an excuse to cut programs they don't like. Okay.
Well put.
Yeah, the Medicaid case rolls are going up because of COVID and because of people losing their jobs and stuff. And that is a big cost driver for the state. It's very simple in terms of big numbers. 2/3 of the budget, 2/3 is in 2 areas: public education and healthcare, and everything else makes up the other 1/3. So, you know, people are also using, I should, in the interest of fairness, I should make the point that Democrats as well are using the budget deficit as a reason to argue to kill programs they don't like. Good example, those 3 toll roads.
Right.
There's an effort underway by Democrats, mostly Democrats. I think they have a little bit of Republican support to put the brakes on these 3 toll roads. You know the story. They're in interior parts of the state. They are extremely unpopular, according to task force public hearings. We saw the testimony was overwhelmingly against them. People are driving a lot less because of COVID-19. You know, where's the clamor for more asphalt and another 330 miles more of toll roads in Florida? So we're going to have a good debate over that in the next few weeks.
Right, and I think the salient factor there that has not been recognized in the commentary and discussions is the fact that when you have less driving, you have less toll revenue, and in order to build, as you said, these 300 plus miles of road, the state is not going to pay for that out of pocket. They're going to have to go to the bond market, and you pledge the revenues from tolls to underwrite the bonds. And if there's less driving, then the projections for the toll revenues will be lower, and that will therefore either reduce the state's bond rating, which makes the cost of borrowing higher, or it will result in increases in tolls on existing toll roads, which will not be a very popular thing, I would suggest.
Right. Yeah, agree. One of the biggest problems with people being on the road less is gasoline tax revenues drop as well. So
Right.
we already have one of the lowest gas taxes in the country, and the legislature is not going to touch that. That's the source for the DOT 5-year work program, obviously. And so people are driving less, the tax revenues are in decline. And so there's less money to build roads and to repair roads and bridges too.
Right, and they've announced this week that they're taking a number of projects out of the 5-year work plan for exactly the reason that you just stated.
Yeah, I saw that. So it's going to be a bit of a tight budget year. But it's interesting, you know, Ron DeSantis is asking for $4 billion more. Anybody would rightly ask, where's the money coming from? The answer is very simple: Washington. They're plugging they're plugging holes with federal CARES Act money, as is every
Right.
other state. And so this harkens back to the economic stimulus program of the Obama years. On the one hand, Republicans don't like big spending programs. They don't like, you know, Washington running up the deficit. But on the other, but if you really don't like it, then stand behind your philosophy. Don't take the money from Washington. But no,
Right.
it's too tempting. They're going to take the money, and we need the money, and so forth. So,
Well, there's, yeah, as you point out, in the, at least in the outlines of the Biden stimulus package, there's $350 billion for state and local governments. And I think most people expect that Florida would get $5 or $6 billion from that, which there goes your $2 billion shortfall and almost pays for the $4 billion budget increase that DeSantis has asked for.
that's right. You know, there might be a fight on something else that's really of interest, and that's college and state university tuition. Now, it's been frozen for 10 years. Rick Scott froze college tuition. But many of the colleges and universities think it's going on for too long. Again, it's not an easy case to make during a economic slide that we're in to raise the cost of a college education, but it's been artificially low for a long time. And the universities just want the flexibility to raise it as they see fit. The Senate President, Wilton Simpson, who's a conservative Republican, is in favor of tuition flexibility.
Wow.
That's a potential big source of money. And that would enable state colleges, we used to call them community colleges, and universities that would provide them a buffer against future cuts.
Or against the economic downturn. Well, that's a nice segue because as you and I have discussed before, and I think we've discussed on some of the reports we've provided to Eleanor and her team, that because of term limits, the culture of the legislature has changed to the extent that the priorities of the people who are in the leadership, i.e. the Senate President and the Speaker of the House, really drive the process. And you mentioned, for example, Senator Wilton Simpson, who's the Senate President, who, as you said, wants to give the state university system and the Florida college system more flexibility with respect to tuition. What are his other priorities as you see them right now? And then we'll move to the House.
He's a big advocate for making changes and improvements to the foster care system. Foster care system in Florida is broken. It's historically underfunded, doesn't serve children or families very well. Simpson is passionate about that issue, and he's talked about the need to put the way you improve a program in Florida like that, unavoidably, it's going to need money, lots of money and attention from Tallahassee. And so making change, that's not a sexy program that has a huge built-in constituency. And so I give Simpson credit for shining a light in a place where there's not an automatic amount of public interest and a stampede from the general public. That's the main thing I think that that Simpson is interested in.
Does he have a stated position on the new toll roads in light of the budget situation?
No, I don't recall him being definitive about it. I think of Simpson as being generally supportive of the toll roads. Keep in mind, it was the #1 priority of his predecessor. The reason
Right.
the toll roads are a creature of Bill Galvano, the last Senate president. It's going to be fascinating to see if they stop the projects or delay them or slow them down, and it'll reinforce something that's an oddity about Florida politics, a Tallahassee truism that you know, when you're a Senate president or a House Speaker, you better grab for all the gusto you can, because when you walk out the door, you know, not many people remember who you were 6 months later. You know, you're easily forgotten in this environment.
Right,
It's
and I
not
think
like-
there's an example of that. Our people are familiar with the Senate president before Bill Galvano, Joe Negron, who was very interested in a particular approach to Everglades restoration. And I've read that Senator Simpson, the now Senate president, doesn't necessarily agree with that. And I think that's a perfect example of what you're talking about, that how you try to sustain these leadership initiatives over time is very, very difficult.
Right.
And then the other factor, which I know you're aware of, Steve, is because of the power of these presiding officers, they really have almost complete control over which bills come to the floor. And that's, you can tell that by the fact that the next speaker and the next Senate president are both chairs of the rules committees in both the House and Senate, which determine, as I said, which bills are actually considered for full votes by the legislature.
Yeah, the system is fundamentally undemocratic. Too few people. This is especially true in the House. A handful of people make all the key decisions.
Yeah.
It's highly scripted. The committee process, the process of reviewing legislation in the committee process can be a sham proceeding where the outcome is preordained before it even happens. However, and maybe we'll get to this, however, the pandemic has created this incredible opportunity for them to provide greater technological access to the general public, because you have to go to, they're not allowing people to, well, the Senate is not allowing people to testify inside the Capitol. The Senate side of the Capitol building is closed to the general public. And people have a constitutional right to be heard at a legislative meeting. So how do you do that? People are being told to drive to the Civic Center, basketball arena next to the Capitol, and you testify remotely. And so, as I wrote a column about this a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah, we should elaborate on that. That would be great.
Wait a minute. If you can testify remotely from the Leon County Civic Center, can you testify remotely from downtown Jacksonville? And save yourself having to drive 3 hours over here? Everyone knows how inaccessible the Capitol is in Florida. And so we have morphed by necessity into basically a technologically remote society. What we're doing right now is a reflection of that. You know,
Yeah.
we'd be in a room in Tallahassee someplace or somewhere if we were doing this the old-fashioned way. But this works. But the point is, when it comes to representative government, why not take full advantage of technology? And some legislators have proposed the idea of having regional sites so that you could go to when this anti-riot, anti-mob bill that DeSantis wants to pass, which is cracking down on civil disorder, which has many, many Floridians enraged and upset. And people want to be heard on that issue very much. Why not let people go to the Orlando Orange County Convention Center on International Drive and testify? They are clinging the power brokers in Tallahassee are clinging to the old way of doing things, which is only people who physically show up in Tallahassee get to be heard. And those are mostly lobbyists for paid interests. It's just the way it works. That's the way the system works. And that, as I said, that's wrong. That is anachronistic. It's not fair to people. There's no reason why we can't have at least regional input from people on matters of huge public importance, but they won't do it.
Why do you think that is? It's just a matter of holding on to the ability to, again, control public input and that's.
Well, first of all, the vast majority of legislators that I know do want to hear from their constituents. However, when it comes to the committee chairs and the people at the pinnacle of power making decisions, you know, as I've observed, sometimes they don't want too much democracy. They want just enough democracy in Tallahassee to make it look like they're really serious and concerned.
Right.
But if it means hundreds or thousands of people lining up to be heard, that's too much. We don't want that much democracy. That's a little too much. Now, having said that, it is also true. It's also undeniably true, but I say to this, too bad. It's true that most testimony at legislative committee meetings is redundant. A lot of it is predictable. Some of it is poorly informed. You can't do anything about that. This is the people's government making really important decisions and spending all of our money. People have an absolute right to be heard. And believe me, it just came across the transom again. There are 30 to 40 statewide grassroots organizations are pleading with the legislature to rethink this backward way of thinking of not expanding remote democracy. I'm talking about Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, groups, environmental groups like that. Frankly, to strip the veneer off here, groups that have an agenda that the legislature really doesn't want to hear from too much.
Right.
Anyway, you know, the professional lobbyists who make a living in Tallahassee will always get heard. I don't say that to disparage them. That's what they're really good at, is getting their message through. That's what they're paid to do. And that's how it works in every state capital in the country. But you know, to counterbalance the disproportionate voice that lobbyists have, the easy way to counterbalance that for democracy's sake is let the sun shine in, let the public be heard. Let the public be heard as much as possible. And they don't want to do that. They want to make you drive to the Civic Center to have your voice heard. You know.
Yeah. Well, and that speaks to a poll or a survey that I know you're familiar with, Steve, conducted by a PR guy named Kevin Kate here in Tallahassee. And every couple of years, he surveys all of the aides to the legislators to determine what they consider to be the most efficacious approaches to advocacy. And it absolutely underscores what you just said. He determined that most advocacy efforts spend time and money on things that make, quote, absolutely no difference for legislators. He's speaking of form emails. He called it rudderless TV advertising, social media, grass tops, and at least according to the aides, a phone call is a very effective way to reach your legislator. And even more importantly, a constituent visit in the district, an in-person visit. He said legislators, according to their aides, are almost 80% more likely to be receptive to that. And he talked also about methods legislators use to communicate with constituents. and 86% said that they would be open to attending events in their districts. And that, to me, is a huge advantage for park advocates, because you have venues where you have people and where you can bring a legislator, and particularly as we've discussed in this call, as these campaigns take longer and longer and longer, notwithstanding social media, I think the legislators are still interested in trying to get their faces in front of their constituents in a personal way. Would you agree with that?
I would very much. Yeah, I think so. Like I said, I think most legislators appreciate hearing from the folks back home. I don't think, I don't think petitions and form letters move the needle one iota.
Right.
But I think a handwritten letter, or like you said, a personal phone call or showing up is really important. Keep in mind, again, I know that people don't follow redistricting very closely, but I'll tell you, the politicians in Tallahassee sure do.
Oh, man.
Because even though the system in the legislature I'm talking about, even though the system strongly favors Republicans going forward, they have an advantage in numbers, in terms of number of seats they control. They have the advantage in money. They generally do a better job at recruiting candidates. The voter registration trend in the state is narrowing very, very consistently, so that the Republicans have almost caught Democrats in total voter registration. It's under
Which would
100.
be the first time since Reconstruction, right? I mean,
Probably, yes.
yeah.
Now, we all know that, we all know that the back to your thing about people in North Florida is Alabama with more guns. We already know that a lot of people in North Florida who call themselves Democrats vote Republican.
Right.
That was always the case in presidential elections, but now it's the case in state and local elections. That's the difference. Is that
Well, I think an interesting segue on that, Stephen, I know you've written a lot about it, is the increase in people who say they have no party affiliation. And how does that play out in all this, in your view?
it's very important. Almost 30% of the voters in the state are registered with no party. And who are they? Well, I don't have a scientific mathematical snapshot I can paint with a broad brush. NPA voters tend to be younger. They tend to be more passive voters. That is, while they had a good showing in November in the presidential election, they generally vote at a lower percentage. They're less likely to vote than are Democrats or Republicans. A lot of NPA voters are Hispanics. So, most people who register to vote now in Florida register to vote when they get a renewed driver's license. That's where most voter registration goes on. And the clerk is supposed to tell or ask everybody, Mr. Jones, are you registered to vote? No. Do you want to register to vote? Yeah, okay, I'll register to vote. And you're supposed to check Democrat or Republican or a minor party. And if you don't check that box, if you don't check any box, you are automatically classified as a no party affiliation voter. You default to NPA because you didn't make a choice. So
I didn't realize that.
That's the law.
Extraordinary.
That's the law in Florida. And so that's how a lot of people end up as NPA voters. So right from the get-go, they're not interested enough in the political process to even declare a party affiliation. So
right.
They're not stampeding to get to the polls. Having said that, this is why that ballot initiative last November was such a big deal, that would have opened up primary elections to all voters, and it failed. It didn't fail by much. It failed by about 2 points. But it's one of the few things the Democrats and Republicans agree on in this state is they don't want NPA voters voting in primary elections because they're going to screw everything up. They're going to, first of all, they're going to make the turnout a lot bigger, and the two parties definitely don't want that. Same old thing about, we want just enough democracy to look like it's democratic, but no, we don't want everybody voting. That's what the parties definitely do not want. So they can vote in November, but that's about it. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, and other states, by the way, I think in Massachusetts, which people think of as a very liberal state, which it is, but in Massachusetts, something like 60% of the voters in Massachusetts are registered with no party affiliation. What's the difference? They can vote in primary elections. They can
Right.
vote all the time. You can't vote. You basically can't vote down here unless you're a Democrat or a Republican.
And the primaries, this leads to the polarization because these primary elections attract the most committed Democrat voters and the most committed Republican voters, who are respectively the most liberal Democrats and the most conservative Republicans. So it leads to further polarization. Eleanor, we're running out of time here, and we'd be glad to take a few questions if that would be appropriate.
One question I have for both of you, because I can't remember which one of you mentioned it, but there was a comment that the posturing for the gubernatorial election will begin happening sooner, probably this summer, than what it normally does. So given that, how will that have any impact on what gets done during the session? And beyond that, do we see kind of the early departure of some of the state agency heads, which usually happens when there's about a year's left of a governor's term? And then third part of that question is there still a rumor floating that our governor has his eyes set on going back to Washington?
Yeah, sure. DeSantis was just on, what did he do? He guest hosted Fox and Friends weekend show and left the door open to running for president in 2024. So I think that's still, Eleanor, I think that is still a distinct possibility. First of all, and I don't know for sure if he's going to do that. Lester would know more about this than me, perhaps, but it helps DeSantis's fundraising. It helps
Yes.
Helps it immeasurably because Ron DeSantis can go to Ogden, Utah to raise money for his 22 gubernatorial campaign, because a handful of people in Ogden, Utah who really like Ron DeSantis say, I'll be with you in 22, and you know what, I'll be with you in 24 too if you run for president. Yes, really quickly, I see we have more questions. Yes, the stampede of agency heads is going to intensify. More agency heads are leaving. It's a normal, common thing. In fact, frankly, his chief of staff, Shane Strum, who's quitting to become a hospital executive in South Florida, it's surprising Strum lasted this long, frankly.
Yes.
He was to be a chief of staff for more than 2 years. And by the way, during an incredibly stressful, difficult pandemic is an astonishing thing to do. And let's see, the other question Eleanor had was, I guess the length of the campaign for governor and so forth.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's to DeSantis's advantage if the Democrats are all disorganized and there's 8 or 9 Democrats running for governor. That's exactly what DeSantis and the Republicans want to see. It would be better, but it's unrealistic. But it'd be better if the Democrats could quickly coalesce behind one candidate who could raise $80 million and have but that's not the way the system works. It's not the way the system's designed to work, and it probably won't work that way in reality.
All right. Jennifer, I'm gonna have you unmute yourself and ask your question because you had several points there.
Yeah, sorry, it's a long question. Hi, Lester and Steve. Thanks so much for the time you took with us today. So I think we're seeing now with term limits, and we just passed term limits in Palm Beach County where we have a maximum of 8 years. So we're seeing people cycling kind of to the state level and back to the local level. People that have been in state offices returning to us here. Most recently, Maria Sachs is now a county commissioner for us. Mac Bernard and Dave Kerner have all been at the state level. And then I think we have some local commissioners that have state aspirations like Melissa McKinley and others. So as we see them kind of cycle to from the state and back to local and the adjustments they're making, should our approach in your experience change at all as we're speaking with them about issues maybe on the local level versus how we would approach them in a state office? And I'm just kind of wondering, and if you don't have any advice, that's okay. But we were just reminded that no one commissioner can give our departments direction. And it wasn't Parks and Recreation, but someone told someone something that I think they thought they had to execute. But the county administrator was clear that that direction comes from her. So I just wanted to kind of open that up for any advice you have for any of us.
Well, my advice would be to follow the money. And if you feel that your county commissioners or other people in your county, city commissioners are making more of the decisions that affect your work, I would concentrate my efforts there as opposed to the legislature, although we certainly need, and I know you're a great advocate, we need your help with the FERDAP Parks funding, but in general, I would say focus on the local people, and you can build relationships with them, whether they're in state government or local government. And at the end of the day, this is a relationship business. So I would focus on that.
I think that's good advice, because I think the Parks and Recreation relationships we have with people that were maybe local elected officials, and then as they kind of ascend to a state office, that view of Parks and Recreation has already almost been set. It's whatever interaction they had at that local level, they kind of carry with them.
And then I'll add a cynical comment at the end. A lot of the time, in my opinion, the reason that you see people transition from the state legislature to local governments is in most jurisdictions, the pensions are much more robust at the local level.
I think this is a great question you've raised, Jennifer, because I've written about it. It's become an epidemic of term limited politicians who all of a sudden wake up one morning and they want to be supervisors of election. They want to be a property appraiser.
Right.
They want to be a county commissioners. A really important distinction is that, first of all, as you know, everything in Tallahassee is a deal. Everything in Tallahassee is a deal. That's on some level. And it's not a good thing, but it's the way the system works. You're not going to change it. It's how the legislature worked 100 years ago. Right, Lester? I mean,
right, exactly.
So local officials, local county commissioners, they live under the Sunshine Law. They better live under the Sunshine Law if they don't want to go to the county jail. And so they have to make an awkward transition from a collegial body that is not subject to the Sunshine Law, the Open Meetings Law, to something much more rigorous and strict. And I think people should use that to their advantage. But I see the same. I'm very familiar in my work with the Broward County Commission. The Broward County Commission's got about 4 former legislators on it. It looks like, if you looked at a picture of the Broward County Commission, you'd say, oh, this is the Broward County Legislative Delegation.
Right.
No, it's not. It's the Broward County Commission. They're former legislators. And so you have to remember that they're used to cutting deals in Tallahassee, and they've brought some of those bad habits back with them to their local level.
Excellent.
Lester, sticking to the topic of home rule, I know that during the last 11 months dealing with COVID, it seemed that the governor was, at least outwardly, it seemed like the governor was very much supporting home rule from the standpoint of letting restrictions and access issues, COVID related, really rest with the county elected bodies. Is that a true belief of his in home rule, or was that just an easy way to not impose some state mandated requirements?
Wow, that's a good question. I have no idea. I know that Steve and I have talked about this at length, and he's written columns about it. on the theme of home rule, there's an increasing penchant by the legislature to overrule, in effect, local governments, what we call here in Tallahassee preemptions. I think there's a preemption bill this year about smoking in parks and that sort of thing. But last year, I think there were 55 of them. They're probably going to be more this year. The governor, on some of the more significant ones, has had a philosophy, more or less, of home rule. But I'd be really interested in Steve's thoughts on that. And Steve is going to have to depart shortly, but I'm going to stay on the line as long as y'all want me to. But he's got some other responsibilities that start at 3 o'clock. So, Steve, you want the governor's philosophy on home rule? That's a hard one for me.
Well, Ron DeSantis did one good thing in this regard. He vetoed a bill last year. I think it was in the 2020 session. Again, I'm losing track. He vetoed a bill that would have prevented local ordinances banning plastic straws.
Right.
So cities and counties can still do that. They run roughshod over home rule in Tallahassee. They do it every year. It's funny that people serve in local government, then they get to Tallahassee and forget that they served in local government. And the other aspect of this that's worth noting and undeniably a fact is that look around. Who's running City Hall? I'll tell you who's running City Hall. Democrats, for the most part.
Yeah.
The mayor of Tampa is a Democrat. Mayor of St. Pete's a Democrat. Mayor of Fort Lauderdale is a Democrat, and on and on. The mayor of Hialeah is a Republican who's a critic of the way Ron DeSantis handled the pandemic. Most cities, not just in Florida, most cities in the United States are blue. Even in states where the legislature is a deep red, like it is here, you just can't ignore that contrast. So that's why the attack on home rule is going to continue.
Oh, it's a very interesting way to think about it. Steve, thank you again so much, particularly this time of year. I know you have a lot of responsibilities on your plate right now, but we really, really appreciate your time and insights.
All right.
I learned a lot as usual. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much.
And Lester, we'll continue with you a little bit. We received the list, the FERDAP list today, the ranking list signed by the Secretary of DEP. They've asked us to sit on that until next Wednesday so they can notify those applicants that were declared ineligible. So we will do that, but Wednesday, bright and early, Lester will start doing his magic with the list downtown at the Capitol. Lester, can you kind of talk a little bit to us? You know, we've become very comfortable with your advocacy on our behalf and your successful efforts in getting us funding for FERDAP in years where we didn't think we were going to get funding. But can you talk a little bit this year, the importance of those on the call to get to their legislators in the next couple weeks before they get to Tallahassee, especially since our access to those folks here in Tallahassee is going to be somewhat limited this year, and the budget is going to be somewhat slim.
Yeah, it's critically important. This is, and the way that I describe it to legislators is this is a program that is objective. This is not a pork barrel thing that's somehow jammed together by the Department of Environmental Protection. There are objective evaluations of the projects. And for the larger projects, there's a local match required. So it's not just a handout. 2 points, right? No handout, objective process. The funding was not in the department's budget request this year. Of course, it wasn't last year and it wasn't the year before that. And they tell Eleanor and I, well, we don't need to put it in our budget request because we know you can go over there and get the money. And we've done that. successfully, but it makes the mountain a little bit harder to climb. So your local contacts where you can tell a legislator, this is a project that's going to create a park in this neighborhood to serve this community, is really, really important, because particularly in the appropriations process, there is some ability, notwithstanding the cynicism that Steve and I have just shared with you about how the system is largely leadership driven. They do, and particularly for the Republican Party, they want to give their members something that they can quote unquote take home. And in a tough budget year, these individual member projects, if you will recall, the governor vetoed $1 billion worth of those individual member projects last year. He did not veto our $12.6 million FERDAP appropriation. So it's a way for members to bring the bacon home, I guess, to use a tired metaphor. And so those local contacts couldn't be more important.
Does it help this year, or is there really no impact if our folks are really demonstrating how they use some of those spaces to address pandemic needs for testing sites or vaccination sites or feeding sites, or using, kind of repurposing staff and facilities to do mortgage assistance and all of those things that have been pandemic related? Does that help in telling that story? Does that impact the legislators' view on this, you think?
I think it might impact the view. My fear is we don't want to have a message that's too complicated. So if you have, for example, a project in your area and you can show what Eleanor just described, that your agency is proactive, even though I hate that word, but is aggressively pivoting to deal with the COVID impacts, certainly that helps, absolutely.
Great. We do not have any more questions in the chat for now, but Lester, we just want to thank you again for being here and getting Steve here with us. He's just a wealth of information, and I know the Zoom calls are not as interactive as when we have the two of you on camera in front of a video camera downtown to watch. If you ever are in Tallahassee and you see Lester walking around and Steve's with him, I never want to encourage eavesdropping, but get a little close and eavesdrop, because the banter between these two folks is not only educational, but in a lot of cases hilarious to listen to them tell the story of what's really happening in the back halls of the Capitol. So we really appreciate your insight and appreciate your time being with us today. And we know we'll do a couple more of these throughout the session, and we just appreciate you making yourself available to us.
Well, I'm glad to do it, and I hope that everybody on the call benefited as much as I did from Steve's observations. I took a whole page of notes of things that I hadn't heard him say or not remembered that he had said, that are really perceptive observations about how the process here really works. And then some of his knowledge of the political nuances is just amazing.
Well, and you know, as uncomfortable as it is to really get to get political between Republican and Democrat and try to walk that little balance theme right there, is so important in understanding how things really happen up here in Tallahassee. And it's really, you know, a shifting and, you know, more and more. I don't know that being an R or a D really is going to be as impactful as it's been in the past, as much as can people get up here and work with each other and cross the lines back and forth. And so much of whether that works or not is dependent on what's happening in Washington, unfortunately. So I think the last year, the last 3 years, the last 8 years, however you want to look at it, has definitely impacted politics here in Florida. And the good news is, you know, earlier we had predicted to our members that our governor's relationship with former President Trump could come back to bite us when it came to pandemic relief, but it seems like that has not panned out to be the case.
Right.
It seems like Florida is actually getting a lot of attention from the current administration. Our doses are increasing of vaccines every week, it seems like. So it's going to keep us on track, I think, to address some of those issues and really try to get the state back to some sense of normalcy. So
Right.
it's interesting to hear the predictions and even more interesting to look back and see whether they really came true or not. So we appreciate your expertise, Lester, and thank you everybody for being on the call. If you've got any follow-up questions, feel free to email us here at the office
absolutely.
and we'll get those questions to Lester and get an answer for you.
We sure will. Thank you again. I enjoyed it very much.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
And thank you.